The relationship between the United States and Ukraine has been a complex tapestry of cooperation and tension, marked by moments of both promise and disillusionment. Since Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, the U.S. has sought to foster a stable and democratic Ukraine, viewing it as a crucial buffer against Russian influence in the region. U.S. support for Ukraine has manifested in various forms, including financial aid, technical assistance, and military cooperation. However, this partnership has not always been smooth sailing. Ukraine's history of corruption, political instability, and its precarious position in Russia's shadow have posed significant challenges to U.S. policymakers. The 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia and the subsequent war in eastern Ukraine further complicated matters, drawing the U.S. deeper into the conflict and straining relations with Moscow. Despite these challenges, the U.S. has remained a steadfast supporter of Ukraine, providing billions of dollars in aid and military equipment to bolster its defenses against Russian aggression. Successive U.S. administrations have recognized the importance of a sovereign and independent Ukraine, both for regional stability and for the broader principles of international law and order. However, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and his subsequent re-election in 2024 marked a turning point in U.S.-Ukraine relations, ushering in an era of unprecedented tension and uncertainty. Trump's unorthodox foreign policy, his skepticism of traditional alliances, and his personal affinity for Russian President Vladimir Putin would have profound implications for Ukraine's fate. The re-election of Donald Trump in November 2024 sent shockwaves through Ukraine, casting a long shadow over the country's future. Trump's first term had been marked by ambivalence towards Ukraine, with the president often expressing admiration for Putin and questioning the value of U.S. support for Kiev. His re-election raised fears that he would pursue a more openly pro-Russian policy, potentially abandoning Ukraine to its fate. These fears were soon realized. In the months following his inauguration, Trump intensified his rhetoric against Ukraine, publicly questioning its commitment to fighting corruption and accusing it of being beholden to Russia. He began to openly advocate for a negotiated settlement to the conflict, even if it meant Ukraine making concessions to Russia. Trump's stance on Ukraine was met with alarm by both Democrats and Republicans in Congress, who viewed it as a betrayal of a key U.S. ally and a dangerous concession to Russian aggression. However, Trump, emboldened by his re-election victory and his control over the Republican Party, seemed unfazed by these criticisms. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky watched with growing trepidation as the U.S., Ukraine's most important international backer, seemed to be turning its back on the country. Zelensky, a former comedian who had swept to power in 2019 on a promise to end the war and clean up corruption, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. The simmering tensions between Trump and Zelensky finally erupted into a full-blown diplomatic crisis in February 2025. Zelensky traveled to Washington to meet with Trump at the White House, hoping to secure assurances of continued U.S. support. Instead, he walked into a diplomatic maelstrom. The meeting, which took place in the Oval Office, was described by sources as tense and confrontational. Trump, according to reports, berated Zelensky for not doing enough to investigate his political rivals and accused him of ingratitude for U.S. support. He reportedly told Zelensky that he should do us a favor and launch an investigation into Joe Biden's son Hunter, who had business dealings in Ukraine. Zelensky, taken aback by Trump's accusations and demands, reportedly pushed back, defending his record and insisting that Ukraine was committed to fighting corruption. However, his protests seemed to fall on deaf ears. Trump, according to sources, remained fixated on his demands for investigations and his grievances against Ukraine. The meeting ended without a resolution, with both sides deeply frustrated and disillusioned. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and severe. News of Trump's pressure campaign on Zelensky to investigate his political rivals quickly leaked, setting off a political firestorm in Washington and prompting calls for impeachment. In the aftermath of the disastrous Oval Office meeting, Trump unleashed a torrent of accusations and insults against Zelensky, further poisoning the relationship between the two leaders. Trump publicly questioned Zelensky's commitment to fighting corruption, accused him of being a puppet of Russia, and suggested that Ukraine was not a real country. Zelensky, he's all talk and no action, Trump declared at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania. He's been in office for years, and the corruption is worse than ever. He's probably in cahoots with Putin, if you want to know the truth. Trump's rhetoric was amplified by his allies in the media and in Congress, who echoed his accusations against Zelensky and Ukraine. Conservative commentators accused Zelensky of being a deep state operative who was trying to undermine Trump's presidency, while Republican lawmakers called for investigations into Ukraine's alleged interference in the 2024 election. Trump's onslaught against Zelensky had a devastating impact on Ukraine's international standing. The country, already struggling to maintain its territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression, now found itself facing a diplomatic onslaught from its most important ally. Moreover, Trump's accusations against Zelensky emboldened Russia, which had long sought to portray Ukraine as a failed state led by corrupt and incompetent politicians. Putin, sensing an opportunity to exploit the rift between the US and Ukraine, stepped up his military and diplomatic pressure on Kyiv. Section 5. Europe steps up, a beacon of support for Ukraine. As the United States, under the Trump administration, retreated from its traditional role as a guarantor of European security and a champion of democratic values, European leaders found themselves increasingly at odds with Washington. The transatlantic alliance, once considered the bedrock of the post-war world order, was showing signs of strain. Nowhere was this rift more apparent than in the response to the escalating crisis in Ukraine. While Trump seemed content to appease Putin and abandon Ukraine to its fate, European leaders recognized the strategic importance of a stable and independent Ukraine and the dangers of allowing Russia to redraw the map of Europe by force. In a show of solidarity with Ukraine and a rebuke to Trump's isolationist policies, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted a summit in London in March 2025, bringing together European leaders to discuss the crisis. The summit, which was attended by Zelensky, focused on ways to increase political, economic, and military support for Ukraine. "We stand united in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity," Starmer declared in his opening remarks at the summit. "We will not allow Russia to dictate the future of Europe." The summit resulted in a number of concrete measures to support Ukraine, including increased financial assistance, expanded sanctions against Russia, and the deployment of additional NATO troops to Eastern Europe. While these measures fell short of what Zelensky had hoped for, they sent a clear message to Moscow that Europe would not stand idly by as Russia sought to destabilize its neighbor. Section 6. The looming threat, a potential halt to U.S. military aid. As the crisis in Ukraine deepened and the relationship between Trump and Zelensky continued to deteriorate, the specter of a potential halt to U.S. military aid loomed large over Kiev. U.S. military assistance, which had been crucial in helping Ukraine defend itself against Russian-backed separatists, was now in jeopardy. Trump had long expressed skepticism about the value of U.S. support for Ukraine, arguing that it was a waste of taxpayer money and that the U.S. had no vital interests at stake in the conflict. He had repeatedly threatened to cut off aid to Ukraine, using it as leverage to try to force Zelensky to do his bidding. "We're giving them billions of dollars and they're not doing anything for us," Trump complained at a rally in Ohio. "They're not even grateful. If they want our money, they're going to have to start playing by our rules." The possibility of a U.S. aid cutoff sent shockwaves through Ukraine, where military commanders warned that it would have a devastating impact on their ability to defend the country. Without continued U.S. support, Ukraine would be outmatched and outgunned by Russia, leaving it vulnerable to further aggression. Section 7. The battlefield reality, Ukraine's dependence on continued support. On the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, the impact of the deteriorating relationship between the US and Ukraine was being felt acutely. The war, which had been raging for over a decade, had settled into a bloody stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Ukraine's armed forces, despite being outgunned and outnumbered by their Russian-backed adversaries, had fought bravely, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy and preventing them from making any significant territorial gains. However, Ukraine's military successes were heavily reliant on continued U.S. military assistance. U.S.-supplied Javelin anti-tank missiles had proven to be particularly effective, allowing Ukrainian troops to destroy numerous Russian tanks and armored vehicles. U.S. intelligence sharing and training had also been crucial in helping Ukraine level the playing field against a more powerful adversary. A cutoff of U.S. military aid would be a devastating blow to Ukraine's war effort. Without continued access to advanced weaponry, intelligence, and training, Ukraine's military would struggle to hold the line against a determined Russian offensive. Moreover, a U.S. withdrawal of support would likely embolden Russia, which would interpret it as a sign of Western weakness and a green light to escalate its aggression against Ukraine. The consequences for Ukraine and for the broader regional security situation would be dire. Section 8. A divided front, the fracturing of the Western alliance. The crisis in Ukraine exposed the deep divisions that had emerged within the Western alliance, particularly between the United States and Europe. Trump's America First foreign policy, his disdain for multilateralism, and his personal affinity for Putin had alienated many of America's traditional allies who questioned his commitment to NATO and the liberal international order. Europe, facing a resurgent Russia on its eastern flank, viewed the crisis in Ukraine through a different lens than Trump. European leaders recognized the strategic importance of a stable and independent Ukraine, both as a buffer against Russian expansionism and as a bulwark of democracy in a region increasingly dominated by authoritarianism. Trump's willingness to appease Putin and his threats to cut off support for Ukraine were met with alarm and dismay in European capitals. European leaders feared that Trump's actions were emboldening Putin and undermining NATO, the cornerstone of European security since the end of World War II. The rift between the US and Europe was on full display at the NATO summit in Brussels in July 2025. Trump, in a contentious meeting with his counterparts, reportedly berated them for not spending enough on defense and threatened to withdraw the US from the alliance if they did not meet his demands. "We're not going to keep protecting countries that aren't willing to protect themselves," Trump reportedly told the assembled leaders. "If you're not willing to pay up, then maybe you need to find someone else to defend you." Trump's outburst sent shockwaves through the alliance, raising fears that he was serious about abandoning NATO. European leaders, caught off guard by Trump's tirade, scrambled to salvage the situation, but the damage had been done. Section 9. Conclusion. An uncertain future for Ukraine. As of March 2025, the future of Ukraine remains precariously balanced, held hostage to the whims of a volatile US president and the geopolitical machinations of a more assertive Russia. The deterioration of US-Ukraine relations under the Trump administration, culminating in the diplomatic debacle of February 2025, has left Ukraine feeling isolated, betrayed, and deeply uncertain about its future prospects. The potential cessation of US military aid, a very real possibility given Trump's past pronouncements and his transactional approach to foreign policy, would be a devastating blow to Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russian aggression. It would also send a dangerous message to Moscow, signaling that the West is divided and unwilling to stand up to Russian expansionism. The fracturing of the Western alliance, a trend that predates the Trump presidency but has been greatly exacerbated by his policies, has further complicated the situation in Ukraine. With the US and Europe increasingly at odds over a range of issues, from trade to security, the international community's ability to present a united front in support of Ukraine has been severely compromised. In this uncertain environment, Ukraine finds itself caught in the middle of a geopolitical tug-of-war between the US and Russia. Its fate will likely be determined by the outcome of this struggle, a struggle in which Ukraine itself has little control.